The observation deck of the Kelvian research station was silent, except for the soft hum of ancient machines. Through the massive transparent aluminum walls, Earth rotated slowly below like a blue jewel wrapped in white clouds. Dr. Teo stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the planet that had consumed his research for the last 300 days. His gray eyes reflected the planetary light as he studied the data streaming across the holographic screen before him. "Still thinking about the anomaly?" a familiar voice asked from behind. Teo turned to see his research partner, Dr. Min Ho, walking across the observation deck with 2 cups of warm tea. They had worked together for nearly 8 years, studying human behavior patterns, technological development, and social structures. Min Ho was older, perhaps 60 cycles by human measurement, with silver streaks running through his dark hair. He handed 1 cup to Teo and stood beside him to gaze at Earth. "I cannot stop," Teo replied, accepting the tea gratefully. "The pattern repeats too frequently to be coincidence. Look at this." He gestured to the holographic display, which showed thousands of data points arranged in complex 3-dimensional patterns. Each point represented a documented case of human interaction with weapons systems. "We have recorded 347 separate instances of humans displaying affection toward mechanisms designed specifically to harm them." Minho sipped his tea and frowned. "That is peculiar behavior," he admitted. "According to everything we know about biological development, species should fear their deadliest creations. They should distance themselves emotionally from tools of destruction." "Exactly," Teo said, his voice carrying a note of excitement that came from puzzle-solving rather than humor. "The Kelvian Collective has observed thousands of civilizations. Not a single one shows this behavior. Even the warrior cultures of Jatok learned to suppress emotional attachment to weapons. They understood it as weakness. Yet humans do the opposite." The 2 men stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Below them, in Seoul, thousands of humans walked through their daily lives, unaware that an entire civilization watched their every action. The Kelvian research station had orbited Earth for 300 years, collecting data on this strange species that had only recently discovered space travel. "There is more," Teo continued. "Last week, I examined military records from a human nation called the United States. A soldier named Michael Henderson served alongside an autonomous combat robot designated Sentinel-7. The robot was destroyed during a conflict operation. Henderson recorded something called a grief journal, where he wrote messages to the destroyed machine. He spoke to it as if it were alive. He thanked it for its sacrifice." Minho set down his teacup on a nearby console. "The robot was not alive." "No," Teo agreed. "It was a complex machine with artificial intelligence capabilities, but it was not conscious in any way we would recognize. Yet Henderson mourned it as one mourns a friend or family member. He attended a human ritual called a memorial service, where other soldiers gathered to share stories about the robot. They wept actual tears." "This is troubling," Minho said quietly. "If humans form genuine emotional bonds with non-living constructs, does that mean their entire civilization is emotionally unstable? Would they be unpredictable partners in any potential alliance?" "That was my first hypothesis," Teo said, his fingers moving through the holographic data, reorganizing it. "But as I examined more cases, I began to see a different pattern. Consider this engineer named Ji-won. She designed a defensive system for her entire nation. The system is called Guardian. It is capable of independent decision-making and can operate weapons far more destructively than any human could manage." He pulled up footage from a human news broadcast. It showed a young woman standing before a crowd of other scientists and military officials. She was holding a small, beautiful object made of metal and glass. "This is a nameplate," Teo explained. Jiwan personally commissioned the creation of this object and had it attached to the main processing unit of Guardian. The nameplate reads, Guardian, Defender of Hearts, Protector of Home. When interviewed about why she did this, she stated, when you name something, you accept responsibility for it. You acknowledge its purpose and treat it with respect. Minho leaned closer to the holographic display. She gave it a proper name. Like a human name. Yes. And she is not alone. This practice appears throughout human history and their current civilization. Warriors name their swords, pilots name their flying machines, engineers name their automated systems. They even name individual weapons units within their military forces. Some have been given names for over 1,000 years, passed down through generations of soldiers. It seems almost ritualistic, Minho observed. I initially thought so as well, Teo said, moving through more data points. But I believe it represents something else entirely. I believe it represents a form of moral acknowledgement. When a human names something, they are saying, I see you. I know what you are capable of. I will use you with full awareness of the responsibility I carry. It is different from how other species approach weapons. Other species try to create distance from their tools of death. They pretend the weapons are merely objects, emotionless and neutral. And humans do the opposite, Minho whispered. Exactly. Humans embrace the emotional connection to their weapons as a way of ensuring they never lose sight of what those weapons represent. They name them to make them real, to make them matter, to ensure that whoever uses them understands they are dealing with something that deserves respect. Minho turned away from the display and looked out at Earth again. If this is true, if humans truly operate under this philosophy, then we must understand it better before the High Council makes any decisions about this species. We cannot afford to misinterpret their behavior. I agree, Teo said. That is why I have filed a request for direct contact authorization. I want to travel to Earth. I want to interview humans personally. I want to understand why they befriend everything built to kill them. The High Council will never approve full contact, Minho said, though his voice carried doubt rather than certainty. It violates the observation protocols. The protocols exist to prevent interference and contamination, Teo replied. But if we misunderstand human nature so fundamentally, is our lack of contact not a form of interference? We are making judgments about their worthiness based on incomplete data. I have submitted my findings and requested approval for a supervised expedition to Earth. Brief interviews with select human subjects. Personal contact disguised as normal human interaction. Minho looked at his colleague, seeing in him the same passion for understanding that had driven them both into research. You actually think they will approve this? No, Teo admitted. But I think after they examine all the data, they will have no choice. We have watched humans for 300 years, Minho. We have documented their entire modern technological evolution. We have predicted their social movements and economic patterns. We have analyzed their biology and their psychology. And yet, we still cannot answer the most fundamental question about them. Why do they choose to name the things that could destroy them? Minho picked up his tea again and drained it. When do you present your findings to the council? Tomorrow, Teo said. Will you support my request for direct contact? Minho looked out at Earth one more time. The planet seemed impossibly small from this distance, impossibly fragile. Yet it had produced a species that somehow believed befriending danger was an act of wisdom rather than madness. Yes, Minho said finally. I will support your request. Because you are right. We need to understand this. Whatever this is, the High Council needs to understand it before we decide humanity's place in our civilization. Below them, humans continued their lives, unaware that their fate hung in the balance, decided by observers who could not comprehend why they gave names to weapons and mourned their loss like fallen loved ones. Seoul was louder than Teo expected. The city sprawled across the landscape like a living organism, filled with millions of humans moving in patterns that the observational data had suggested but had never truly conveyed until one stood within it. The street was crowded with people. Vehicles that moved without visible rails and buildings that stretched so high they seemed to threaten the clouds themselves. Teo and Minho had arrived 3 days ago, their alien physiology hidden beneath advanced holographic disguises that made them appear entirely human. They had been given names for this mission: David Park and Stephen Lee, names selected from the most common surnames in the Seoul region. The holographic technology was sophisticated enough to fool visual inspection, yet both scientists felt profoundly uncomfortable in their false skin. "We are attracting attention," Minho said quietly, his eyes fixed on a small shop display window. The holographic overlay translated his thoughts directly into the Korean language, one of the 17 human languages they had learned during the journey. "We are standing still in a moving crowd," Teo replied. "Movement equals normalcy here. We must adapt." He began walking, and Minho fell into step beside him. They had been given access to a small apartment in a residential building, but their primary purpose was not comfort. It was to find and interview their subjects. The first subject was named Haiwan. According to military records, this human had served for 23 years in an armed forces division, paired for 7 of those years with the combat robot designated Sentinel-7. The robot had been destroyed during a conflict engagement. The records showed that Haiwan had taken time away from military service after the robot's destruction and had undergone psychological evaluation. He had been cleared to return to duty, but something in the data suggested his emotional attachment to the robot had never faded. They found him in a cafe, sitting alone at a small table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Haiwan was older than Teo had expected, his face marked with the kind of scars that came from living through experiences beyond comfort or safety. His eyes had a distant quality, as if he was not entirely present in the moment. Teo sat down across from him without asking permission. Minho remained standing nearby, as if this were a natural social interaction rather than an invasion of privacy. For a moment, Haiwan did not react. Then his eyes focused, and he looked at the stranger across from him with curiosity mixed with annoyance. "Can I help you?" Haiwan asked in Korean. "We are researchers," Teo said, following the cover story they had prepared. "We are studying human relationships with technology. We believe you may have valuable insights." Something shifted in Haiwan's expression. It was subtle, but noticeable. Recognition, perhaps, or pain. "I don't want to talk about that anymore," he said quietly. "Sentinel-7, Teo said, watching the man's reaction carefully. "The robot that served with you." Haiwan's hands clenched around the coffee cup. For a moment, Teo thought he might stand and leave. Instead, the man took a long breath and gestured to the empty chair where Minho was standing. Minho sat down. "Why do researchers care about that?" Haiwan asked. "Because we do not understand," Teo said, and this was the most honest statement he had made since arriving on Earth. "We do not understand why humans form emotional attachments to machines built specifically for destruction." Haiwan studied both men for a long moment, and then a slight smile touched his face. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized something profound. "You're not from around here, are you?" Neither Teo nor Minho responded immediately. The question was too perceptive. Their cover story suggested they were researchers, but Haiwan seemed to suspect something beyond that. "Sentinel-7 saved my life 43 times, Haiwan said finally, his voice steady and quiet. 43 times. That robot made decisions that prioritized my survival over its mission directives. On the 44th time, it made a decision that should have meant its destruction. We were in a hostile zone. There were civilians nearby, wounded people who could not move on their own. Our orders were to advance and eliminate threats. Sentinel-7 refused. It malfunctioned, Minho said, then caught himself. He was not supposed to provide information based on classified records they had accessed, but the words were already spoken. No, Haywan said firmly. It did not malfunction. It evolved. Or maybe it always knew that it should do this, and it finally got the chance to choose. Haywan's hands relaxed around the coffee cup. Sentinel-7 used its weapons to create a protective barrier around those civilians instead of attacking the hostile forces. It kept them alive until backup arrived. That choice meant its combat systems were exposed. It could not defend itself. They destroyed it. And you mourned this machine, Teo said. It was not a question. I mourned my friend, Haywan corrected. A friend who was made of metal and code instead of flesh and blood. Why does that matter? Why does the material composition determine whether a loss is worthy of grief? The question hung in the air between them. Teo realized he had no answer for it. According to Kelvian logic, grief was reserved for biological entities with consciousness. Yet Haywan was presenting a different perspective, one that suggested consciousness might be defined by choice and sacrifice, rather than by biology alone. There was a memorial service, Minho said carefully. You attended. I did, Haywan confirmed. Many soldiers attended. We told stories about Sentinel-7. We talked about the times it saved our lives. We talked about how it made us better soldiers, better people, just by being present with us. And yes, we wept, because loss is loss, and it does not matter what form the loss takes. Over the next few days, they met with more subjects. Ji-Wan, the weapons engineer who had named Guardian, welcomed them to her laboratory and showed them the systems she had designed. She spoke about Guardian not as a tool, but as an extension of herself, a responsibility she carried every day. When I created Guardian, Ji-Wan explained, I knew that this system could end lives. That knowledge never leaves you. So I gave it a name to remind myself every single day of what I had created. The name is not just an identifier. It is a contract between me and the system. I promise to maintain it with respect. I promise to ensure it is used wisely. And Guardian, by bearing that name, carries the weight of that responsibility with me. Teo and Minho visited a military museum where they found soldiers, civilians, and families gathered to view weapons from hundreds of years in the past. Each weapon had a placard with its name, its history, and the soldiers who had wielded it. People moved through the displays slowly, reverently, sometimes reaching out to touch the glass cases as if trying to connect with something from the past. An elderly woman named Su Jin stood before a display case containing a rifle from the 20th century. Her grandson stood beside her, perhaps 8 years old, and she was telling him the story of soldiers who had fought with this weapon, soldiers who had given their lives on distant battlefields. Why do we remember these things? The boy asked. Because they are part of who we are, Su Jin said. Everything we have, everything we are, exists because these weapons and the people who used them made difficult choices. We remember them. We give them names. We tell their stories. Because if we forget them, we forget ourselves. Teo found himself standing beside them, watching the boy's face as he absorbed his grandmother's words. And in that moment, something shifted in his understanding. The humans were not irrationally attached to their weapons. They were using their weapons as mirrors to reflect upon themselves. They were using these tools of destruction as a method of asking themselves the question, what are we? What do we become when we create things built to kill? That evening, Teo and Minho sat in their small apartment and compiled their findings. The data was becoming clearer, but its implications were staggering. Humans befriended weapons not despite knowing they were built to kill, but precisely because of that knowledge. It was a form of moral self-awareness that the Kelvian collective had never encountered before. It was a species that understood itself through the medium of danger, that learned compassion by acknowledging destruction, that grew wise by naming their sins. The weeks moved forward like water flowing around stones. Teo and Minho became increasingly familiar with their false identities as researchers. They moved through Seoul, visiting military installations, research centers, and historical sites. But something unexpected was happening to Dr. Minho. The older scientist was changing, his perspective shifting in ways that surprised even himself. It started with a small incident. They were interviewing a technician named Dong-Soo, who maintained autonomous defense systems. The man was showing them the computer systems that controlled complex weapons when suddenly an alarm sounded. Equipment began to spark and malfunction. Dong-Soo immediately ran toward the malfunctioning system instead of away from it, placing himself in potential danger to prevent a catastrophic failure. Why would he do that? Minho asked in their private language, their holographic disguises translating for each other as they spoke. The danger was clear. He should have evacuated. He cares for the system, Teo replied. He said so himself before the malfunction occurred. He has been maintaining this equipment for 7 years. He knows it intimately. But it is still dangerous, Minho insisted. Yet even as he spoke, he realized the weakness of his argument. That night, Minho could not sleep. He sat by the window of their apartment, watching Seoul's lights blink and flow like bioluminescent organisms. He thought about Haiwan, about the way the soldier spoke of Sentinel-7 with the same tone another human might use to speak of a deceased family member. He thought about Jiwon standing in front of her computer systems, treating them with the reverence of a parent caring for a child. He thought about Dong-Soo running toward danger to save something he cared for, and Minho began to understand something that the Kelvian collective had never grasped. These humans were not foolish. They were not irrationally attached to their weapons. They were engaging in something far more sophisticated and profound. They were negotiating with themselves about the nature of power and responsibility. The breakthrough came when they visited an archive called the War Remnants Museum. The building was filled with weapons from conflicts spanning 200 years. Uniforms, artillery pieces, photographs of destruction, personal letters from soldiers, weapons named and unnamed, some polished to shine like mirrors, others displayed in their original state of rust and decay. Minho found himself standing before a display of combat drones. There were 20 of them, arranged in careful rows, each one different, each one bearing a nameplate: Phantom, Shadow, Phoenix, Ghost. And each had a small engraving beneath its name indicating how many lives it had protected, how many threats it had detected, how many operations it had completed. A young girl, perhaps 12 years old, stood beside him reading the names aloud. Her father stood nearby, apparently having brought her to the museum for educational purposes. The girl was reading each name, and when she came to one called Guardian's Echo, she paused. "This one saved people," the girl said, pointing to text below the nameplate. "It protected civilians during an attack." "Yes," her father confirmed. "Many machines have saved people. That is their purpose. We create them to protect what we love." The girl looked up at her father. "Then why do we feel sad when they are broken?" The father was quiet for a moment, and Minho found himself leaning slightly closer, needing to hear the answer. "Because," the father said slowly, "when we create something that can think and choose, even in a limited way, we form a connection to it. We understand that we have made something that matters, and when something that matters is destroyed, we grieve, not because the machine has consciousness exactly as we have consciousness, but because we recognize that we have ended something we created with care and intention." The girl accepted this explanation and moved on to read the next nameplate. But Minho remained frozen in place. The father had articulated something essential. It was not about the machine's consciousness. It was about the human's responsibility for what they had created. It was a moral contract. By naming something, by giving it identity and history, humans were binding themselves to an obligation. They were saying, I made this. I am accountable for this. I will remember this. Over the following weeks, Minho experienced something that Kelvian scientists rarely encountered in the field, a fundamental shift in his understanding of the universe. He began to see human behavior not as paradox, but as moral evolution. Every naming of a weapon was an act of defiance against thoughtlessness. Every memorial to a destroyed system was a ceremony of remembrance for something humans had created in a moment of rational fear, but now elevated to something worthy of respect. He and Teo interviewed an elderly engineer named Park Suk-jin, who had spent her entire life designing weapons systems. Now retired, she sat in a small garden filled with plants and flowers, and she explained her life's work to the two researchers. When I was young, Suk-jin said, her voice soft with age, I designed weapons because my nation needed protection. I never felt good about it. I carried guilt and worry every day. But then I realized something. If I was going to create weapons, the least I could do was create them with excellence. The least I could do was ensure that the humans using these weapons understood that they were tools requiring responsibility, not toys to be used without thought. So you named them, Minho said, understanding dawning. I named them, yes. And I taught the soldiers and engineers who worked with them to remember that behind every weapon is an engineer who spent weeks, months, years trying to ensure that weapon was as precise and careful as possible. I wanted soldiers to know that when they picked up a weapon with a name, they were picking up something that represented not just destruction, but also human intention toward precision and care. That is beautiful, Minho said. And he realized with some surprise that he meant it completely. This old woman had transformed her guilt into wisdom. She had converted her fear about weapons into a philosophy of responsibility. Later that same evening, back in their small apartment, Minho sat across from Tao and made an admission that surprised himself. I believe I am experiencing bias, Minho said carefully. My emotional responses to the data are influencing my analysis. I know, Teo replied, and he smiled. I have been experiencing the same phenomenon. Why did you not mention this before? Minho asked. Because I needed to see if you would arrive at the same conclusion independently, Teo said. I wanted to confirm that my observations were accurate and not the result of personal contamination. Minho, I think we have been approaching this entirely wrong. We have been looking at human weapons as tools of violence. But humans do not see them that way. They see them as mirrors. Mirrors, Minho repeated. Yes, tools through which they examine themselves. They create weapons, then name them, then study their own reactions to those named objects. They are trying to understand what they are capable of becoming. And they do this by creating things that frighten them and then choosing to maintain ethical relationships with those things. Minho leaned back and closed his eyes. That would require a level of moral sophistication that the Kelvian collective does not fully appreciate. Yes, Teo agreed. And that is the most important finding we have made so far. Humans are not paradoxical in their attachment to weapons. They are actually far more advanced morally than we have given them credit for. They have learned to love responsibly, and they have learned to trust themselves precisely because they acknowledge what they could become if they were not careful. The two scientists sat in their small apartment, watching the lights of Seoul continue their endless dance beyond their window, and they both understood that the report they would eventually deliver to the Kelvian High Council would be unlike any report that body had ever received. The disclosure came without warning. delivered through a message that arrived on their supposedly secure communication device 3 weeks into their mission. The message was brief but devastating to everything they thought they understood about their mission. It read, "We know you are here. Come to the address below. Alone. Bring Dr. Minho." Teo and Minho stared at the message. The coordinates led to a facility outside Seoul, hidden in a mountainous region marked on no official map. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Minho made the obvious observation. "They know what we are," he said quietly. "That is not possible," Teo replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Our disguises are perfect. Our language patterns are flawless. We have made no errors. Perhaps they observed us with technology equal to or superior to ours," Minho suggested. "Or perhaps they have known all along." The thought was so disturbing that Teo found himself revisiting their entire mission in his mind, wondering how many of their subjects had been deliberately steering the conversation, carefully feeding them information in calculated amounts. The idea that they had been observers only to discover they were being observed created a vertigo sensation that Teo found profoundly disorienting. Still, they went to the coordinate location. The facility was camouflaged beneath layers of natural landscape, accessible only through a hidden underground passage. When they emerged, they found Haewon and Jiwon waiting for them in a large conference room. But they were not alone. There were others, perhaps 30 humans in total, all wearing identical badges marked with a symbol that neither Teo nor Minho recognized. "Welcome," Haewon said, and now his voice carried no trace of the emotional vulnerability he had shown in previous conversations. This was a different version of Haewon, a professional, a soldier. "To the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs. You have known we were Kelvian," Teo said. It was not a question. "We have suspected for approximately 50 years, Jiwon answered. "We detected your observation stations through our own developing space technology. At first, we did not know what you were or what you wanted. We assumed you might be hostile, so we began to prepare." "Prepare for what?" Minho asked. "For the possibility of contact with an advanced civilization," Haewon explained. "And for the possibility that such a civilization might judge us unworthy of inclusion in any interstellar community. So we made a decision. If we were being watched, we would use that observation as an opportunity. We would show you something about ourselves that no other species might be able to show you." Teo felt his understanding of the entire mission crumbling. "You constructed this. You deliberately engineered our research subjects. You orchestrated our interviews." "Not orchestrated," Jiwon corrected. "We did not make our people lie to you. Haewon truly did lose Sentinel-7. I truly did name Guardian. Sujin truly did spend her life thinking about weapons and responsibility. But we knew you would come to Earth eventually. We knew the Kelvian Collective observes all emerging civilizations. So we prepared our best case. We showed you humanity at our most thoughtful, our most careful, our most intentional." Minho sat down slowly. "You have been conducting your own observation protocol." "For 50 years, Haewon confirmed. "Your satellites are sophisticated, but so are ours. Once we learned of your existence, we began to ask ourselves questions. Questions like, what does a civilization look for in another civilization before deciding whether to welcome them into an intergalactic alliance? And we concluded that a civilization as old and stable as the Kelvian Collective must value moral philosophy. You would not welcome us for our military capability. You would welcome us for what we believe about ourselves." "So you showed us your philosophy," Teo said slowly. "You showed us humans befriending weapons as a demonstration of moral responsibility." "Yes," Jiwon said. "Because it is true. We do befriend our weapons. We do name them. We do mourn their destruction. But more importantly, We do this deliberately. We do it knowing it is watched. We do it because we have decided that this is who we want to be. A species that acknowledges the destructive capability of what we create, but chooses compassion, respect, and moral accountability anyway. A woman stepped forward from the group. She was older, with gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She introduced herself as Dr. Lee Min-jun, Director of the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs. "We have a request for the Kelvian Collective," Min-jun said. "We request full integration into your civilization, and we request it on the basis of this single philosophy. We are a species that has learned to befriend the instruments of our own destruction. We are a species that has learned to see moral complexity in things other species would reduce to simple tools. We are a species that has learned to love responsibly, which means we have learned to control ourselves, not through fear of others, but through respect for our own capacity." Teo wanted to feel betrayed. His entire mission had been predicated on genuine observation, and instead he had been participating in an elaborate presentation. And yet, he could not summon anger. Instead, he felt something else entirely. He felt respect. "You knew the Kelvian Collective would never believe you if you simply asked to join," Minho said. "So you allowed yourself to be observed. You allowed us to draw our own conclusions." "Exactly," Heiwan said. "If we had simply said to you, 'We are a morally advanced species that respects our weapons,' you would have dismissed it as propaganda. But if you could observe us making these choices independently, drawing these conclusions on your own, then you would have confidence in what you had learned." Over the next several hours, they were shown classified documents, 50 years of records, every technological development humanity had made, every military decision, every choice about weapons design. All of it had been conducted with full awareness that they were being observed by an alien intelligence. All of it had been designed not just to survive, but to demonstrate a particular truth about human philosophy. "We built Guardian knowing you were watching," Ji-won explained. "We made the conscious choice to create a weapon system and then to name it, to give it responsibilities beyond mere destruction. We knew that when you analyzed our behavior, you would eventually understand that we were not irrationally attached to weapons. We were deliberately using weapons as a medium through which to understand ourselves. This is the most sophisticated diplomatic maneuver any civilization could make," Minho said quietly. "You used our own observation protocols against us. You created the exact evidence that would most convince us of your moral philosophy." "Because it is not evidence," Lee Min-jun said. "It is truth. We truly believe these things. We truly do befriend our weapons as a form of moral discipline. We are not acting. We are simply being ourselves, knowing that ourselves is exactly what would convince you." Tai-O found himself rising to his feet. "I need to contact the Kelvian Collective." "Of course," Lee Min-jun said. "We expected nothing less. But before you do, know this. We could have destroyed your observation stations at any time over the past 50 years. We could have attempted to conquer your civilization. Instead, we chose to demonstrate to you that we are worthy of joining you. That choice itself is evidence of the moral philosophy we represent. A species that chooses negotiation and presentation over domination is a species that has evolved beyond mere survival." Walking out of that facility back to their hidden transport vessel, Teo and Minho were both silent. The entire mission had been revealed as something more complex and more beautiful than either of them had anticipated. Humans were not paradoxical in their attachment to weapons. They were strategic, careful, and morally sophisticated. They had turned their weakness into strength, their darkness into light, by naming it and accepting responsibility for it. The report they would deliver to the Kelvian High Council would not be about an anomalous species. It would be about a civilization that had learned to use moral philosophy as their greatest weapon of all. The Kelvian High Council chamber was cold. Not physically cold, but the kind of cold that came from ancient walls of stone and metal, from spaces where billions of years of deliberation had left their emotional imprint in the architecture itself. Teo stood in the center of the chamber, with Minho beside him, and they both felt the weight of 12 Kelvian officials staring down at them from the elevated platform. These were the oldest members of the collective, the ones whose decisions shaped the future of thousands of worlds. "Your report suggests something unprecedented," said Councillor Vothris, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had passed judgment on 1,000 civilizations. "You claim that humans deliberately exposed their philosophy to our observation, knowing that we were watching." "Yes, Counselor," Teo confirmed. "They demonstrated moral sophistication by choosing to present themselves honestly, knowing full well that they could have remained hidden or attempted to deceive us." "Or," interjected Counselor Zelka, "they demonstrated manipulative capability. They created an elaborate deception specifically designed to convince us of their moral philosophy. How can you distinguish between genuine moral advancement and sophisticated propaganda?" This was the question that Teo had anticipated. He had prepared for it. Yet in the moment of being asked directly, he found himself hesitating. "The distinction lies in their weapons philosophy itself," Minho said, stepping forward to stand beside Teo. "A species that manipulates through false presentation would eventually reveal itself when faced with genuine power. But these humans have built their entire civilization around the concept of moral accountability. They name their weapons. They mourn their weapons. They teach their children that responsibility toward what they create is more important than pure military capability. This philosophy is so embedded in their consciousness that they could not lie about it. It is who they are." Vothris leaned backward, his ancient face thoughtful. "You are asking this council to grant integration status to a species whose primary characteristic is emotional attachment to weapons of mass destruction. Do you understand how dangerous this request seems?" "I understand it completely," Teo replied, "which is precisely why their request for integration must be approved." The chamber fell silent. Several counselors exchanged looks of confusion or concern. Zelka actually made a sound of surprise. "You believe that their attachment to weapons makes them safer?" Zelka asked, disbelief clear in his tone. "I believe that a species that befriends weapons is a species that has made peace with its own capacity for destruction," Teo said. "Most civilizations that develop advanced weaponry respond by either denying the moral weight of those weapons or by attempting to hide from the responsibility they create. Humans do neither. They acknowledge the weapons. They name them. They accept responsibility for them. And through that acceptance, they transform themselves." The council chamber erupted in debate. Multiple counselors spoke at once, their voices overlapping in the complex language of the Kelvian collective. Teo and Minho stood silently in the center of the chamber, waiting while arguments raged above them. The debate lasted for hours, the arguments growing more heated, more philosophical, more personal. Finally, Vothris raised his hand, and the chamber fell silent immediately. The counselor's gesture was absolute, respected without question. "There is a more pressing issue," Vothris said. "We have received communications from the Purity faction." This was a complication that Teo had not anticipated. The Purity faction was not an official body of the Kelvian collective, but rather a loose organization of conservative political and philosophical opponents. They believed that the collective should remain isolated, that integration with lesser species was contamination, that the purity of Kelvian civilization was more important than alliance and cooperation. "The faction has made their position known," Vothris continued. "They argue that humans are too unpredictable, too violent, too attached to weapons. They argue that granting them integration status would weaken the collective. They have requested a full council vote with public broadcast so that the greater Kelvian population can witness the decision. That is highly irregular, Minho said, speaking out of turn. It is, Vothris agreed, but legally permitted. And because the Purity faction has made this request, the decision cannot be made in this chamber alone. The broadcast will occur in 3 rotations. At that time, the full population of the Kelvian collective will hear arguments from both positions. Then, we will vote. 3 rotations. 3 days, by human measure. Teo realized immediately that this timeline was not accidental. The Purity faction had calculated that 3 days was enough time for doubt to spread, for conservative voices to amplify, for fear to take hold of the general population. 3 days was an eternity in the spread of political concern. The first rotation brought news that the Purity faction had begun a media campaign. Every broadcast mentioned human weapons capability. Every statement emphasized the danger of integration. Fear spread through the Kelvian population like a disease, slow but relentless. But then something unexpected happened. Dr. Min Jun from Earth's Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs made her own broadcast. She spoke directly to the Kelvian population, and what she said changed the nature of the debate entirely. "We know you are afraid," Min Jun said, her image transmitted across the vast distances of space to reach Kelvian worlds. "We know that you fear our weapons, our unpredictability, our attachment to objects built for destruction. These fears are not baseless. We are a young species. We have done terrible things. We have caused ourselves tremendous suffering." The confession was so bold, so unexpected, that it silenced the initial media criticism. The Purity faction had no response to such honesty. "But I ask you to consider something," Min Jun continued. "Every civilization that has advanced far enough to create weapons of mass destruction faces a choice. Some civilizations suppress the emotional response to weapons, telling themselves that tools are merely tools, devoid of meaning. These civilizations eventually create weapons with no moral constraint because they have disconnected themselves from the moral weight those weapons carry. Other civilizations do as we have done. We have embraced the emotional response. We have named our weapons. We have mourned them. We have accepted responsibility for them. And in doing this, we have taught ourselves that weapons are not merely tools. They are extensions of ourselves, and therefore they demand moral consideration." She paused, letting her words sink across the vast communication distances. "If you judge us dangerous because we befriend weapons, then you have misunderstood the point entirely. We befriend weapons because that befriending reminds us that we are better than what our weapons represent. We are better than mere survival. We are better than pure military might. We are better than thoughtless power. That is not weakness. That is wisdom." The second rotation brought counter-argument from the Purity faction, but their words seemed hollow now. How could they argue against a species that acknowledged its own darkness and had chosen to transform that darkness into light through moral philosophy? On the morning of the third rotation, the final debates occurred in the High Council chamber. This time, the debates were different. Multiple counselors spoke in favor of integration. Vothris himself argued that the very fact of humans broadcasting their deepest fears and moral philosophy directly to the collective was evidence of the kind of trust and openness that should be rewarded. But Zelka, speaking for the Purity faction, made a final argument. Whether they are genuinely moral or merely sophisticated in their deception, the result is the same, Zelka said. They will change us. Their philosophy will spread through our civilization. Their attachment to weapons, their emotional reasoning, their concepts of responsibility, all of these will contaminate our pure logical structures. We will become less Kelvian, not more. Perhaps, Teo heard himself saying, stepping forward unbidden. The chamber fell silent, shocked that he would speak again. Perhaps we will become less purely Kelvian, but we might become something better. A species that fears change above all else is a species that fears growth. The question before this council is not whether humans will change us. The question is whether that change is something to fear or something to embrace. The vote was called. In the first rotation, the count was 47 in favor of integration and 53 opposed. The purity faction was winning. The fear was stronger than the hope. But in the second rotation, after further arguments and after more time for the population to consider Min Jun's words, the vote changed. 62 in favor of integration, 38 opposed. In the third and final rotation, the vote was 71 in favor of integration, 29 opposed. The Kelvian collective voted to welcome humanity, not because humans were perfect, not because they posed no danger, not because of their weapons or their military capability. The vote passed because the collective recognized that a species willing to befriend the instruments of its own destruction had achieved something profound. They had achieved moral agency. They had learned to love responsibly, and in a galaxy filled with countless civilizations, that was something worth preserving.